Hi, Lor. Thanks for coming on the podcast. It's good to see you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
No worries. It's been a while that you've been on the list to get on the podcast for sure. Cool. All right. So I think it would be nice to just start up by, you're obviously a really impressive climber and a coach. And are you recently qualified as a therapist? Is that right?
Yeah, I just finished my master's. So,
Nice. Congratulations.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, it would be kind of cool to just hear sort of like how you describe the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, I work in a couple different capacities. Like the work that I'm working into as a therapist is really looking at how, like, a neurobiological approach to treating trauma. So it's very focused on using modalities of therapy outside of talk therapy. Um, I do a lot of outdoor work. I do a lot of adventure work and body awareness based work to help people feel safe in their bodies again after a traumatic experience. And so that's been really special because it's helped me look at the work that I've done in climbing and then move beyond that to consider all of the different ways that that work in climbing has informed how I can be really just creative in working with people's own resources for healing.
Nice, cool.
Yeah.
There's a lot a lot I could go into already there. Do you mostly work with climbers or are you working with more other people as well?
Yeah. So as a coach, so I work as a coach and as a therapist. As a coach, I work primarily with climbers, almost 100%. And it can range, it's almost always mental training focused, although I do have a physical training background as a coach. And so occasionally I'll do right training plans, especially locally for folks. But with that, it's mainly working through fear and performance anxiety and confidence on the wall. And then as a therapist, I work for a community mental health organization that specifically works with trauma survivors who've experienced sexual assault, domestic violence, or any form of abuse. And so I work in that space. If someone is a climber, it's very circumstantial, but I can take people climbing as a part of that work.
Cool. And so how do you think that your work as a coach in climbing has informed your work as a therapist and vice versa?
Hmm. I think that the main thing that has really been helpful for me is that climbing is such a sport that focuses on the nervous system. And you can really experientially watch someone perform based on how their nervous system is regulated or dysregulated. And it's given me such this tangible example so that when I'm sitting with people, maybe just on a park bench, and we're, chatting or maybe doing a small activity, I have the context of climbing, which kind of it's a really enhanced metaphor of what's going on in the nervous system to use to visualize what someone is experiencing. So I think that's kind of how those two have informed each other. And then my work as a therapist really helps me as a coach to have a lot more context for talking to people about how mental training isn't just like reframing our thoughts, but it's really working with the whole body and how everything is intertwined.
Hmm. Yeah. What sort of barriers do you come up against with climbers specifically when trying to get people to approach things from like in an embodied way rather than like, so much around the conscious thinking mind?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, one of the ones that can be so hard for folks is like the I'm not good at this feeling that they get when we're doing body awareness work. Like just as soon as they hear it, they're like, oh, I tried that and I just get distracted. Or they'll check in with me and they'll say, the whole time I was just thinking about how I wasn't doing it right. So I stopped. And I love working with athletes in that space because I think that coming in as a coach with a really fun, lighthearted approach to it and saying like, oh, that's all part of it though, can like help them get re-engaged. But it does break my heart to think of how long they spent trying to get to this point where they have tried all of these different practices and the whole time they've just thought like, oh, I'm broken, I just don't get it. Because a lot of times by the time people are reaching out for coaching, they've done a lot of mental training on their own or looked into a lot of different resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you're talking about body awareness stuff and sort of embodied approaches, if for someone who really doesn't know what you mean when you say that, can you kind of describe what that work looks like in practical terms?
Yeah, maybe the easiest way would be to make a contrast between like what someone might think mental training is and then what a more embodied approach is. And I think, someone might think that they need to like change the thoughts that they're having while they're climbing. And so they might like come up with a mantra that they're going to say to themselves the whole time, but make it so complex that it involves like a lot of thinking. So they're up on the wall and they're like, okay, I just need to like get into this body position. And then I need to think about how awesome I am. And then I need to like think about my training and how it's really going to carry me through. And it's like, they're just so in their head or sometimes are thinking about their emotions so much like I'm not allowed to be afraid, I need to keep the fear out, like I got to block it out. And when I think about embodied approaches to being on the wall, like we're looking to get people's attention back to much simpler anchors in their body, like not necessarily controlling their breath but thinking about their breath, like or sorry, not sorry, not thinking about their breath, but just
Awareness.
focusing on the feeling of their breath. Yeah, and then where their eyes are going, just taking in points of attention with their eyes, focusing on their pacing and the feeling of relaxation or tension in their body, and not necessarily trying to change any of those things, but just
Mm-hmm.
being aware of them. And
Mm-hmm.
that I'm sure that you have a lot of experience with how much people can struggle to like, they want to make it more complex than that.
Mm.
They want to like add in a lot more. And it's the simplicity of those anchors almost makes them more challenging sometimes.
Yeah, I guess as well, it's so unnatural for us. It's natural and unnatural. I guess it's natural, but it's something we don't practice, right? It's like we're so cerebral in our society, aren't we? Everything is sort of concept based, thought based, idea based. Everything's described by language in a way. And we're always kind of like a lot of the work we do these days is very like in our heads and thought based as well, isn't it? And so to get come back to our bodies is challenging. It's something I feel like I've spent like the last 10 years trying to get better at.
Yeah.
And it was really meditation that kind of opened that up to me. Was there anything that kind of really opened that up for you as like, oh yeah, there's something in this, or was it from more of an academic approach, or was there experience or something like that that really woke you up to it?
Hmm. Yeah, I think as a personal practice for me, like doing body-based self-compassion work was one of the ways that I was really introduced to what it meant to feel embodied. And it was actually through the lens of the health at every size movement and looking at eating disorder recovery through the lens of embodiment, and embodiment being something that fuels social change. That was actually where I ended up finding like the work of Sonia Renee Taylor and Adrienne Marie Brown and a lot of these people who were talking about, we've been taught not to be in our bodies, and learning to be in our bodies can be an act of resistance in itself. That those voices, I had heard a lot about embodiment and I'd always just figured that it wasn't for me.
What made you
And
think
that
that?
was Yeah, that's a complex question, but I think I think partly like I think I was a very like cerebral kid and I was rewarded for that. I think I was rewarded as an athlete for being very consistent and very, as a runner, I was a competitive runner and I was like really rewarded for being very numbers based. Like I could hit my splits every time on exactly the same and was told that that was my strength as a runner. And I think being a gender diverse person, like being in the trans community, I had a lot of messaging that I would like never be in a body that was right. And so I think learning to be like, oh, I can just kind of push my body to the side or almost thinking of dissociation as a superpower that I could bring into situations where I felt afraid. I was like, oh, but I'm so good at ignoring my body anyway that that'll help me perform. That all of those things made it feel really inaccessible to me and almost disinteresting. I was like, oh, I don't know if that embodiment thing is all that important for me. It sounds kind of like out there. And really thinking of it as a part of how I serve my community and a part of what I could pass on, just doing that work internally was part of what I passed on to others. It changed the way that I approached it and it changed that sense of motivation to figure out how I would start to look into it.
That's interesting. What do you think is, I really like the work I do as a coach because I feel like everything I learn like serves myself and others. So it's like this double win in a way. What do you find most motivating in the work that you do? Is it sort of what you can pass on and then that also motivates you to do your own work, or is it kind of your own work first and then that that's motivating also for you to pass it on, like it, or is it, I don't know, like how you kind of balance that, because sometimes the two can be in some ways conflicting too, right?
Yeah. And sometimes they can almost, it's like they almost are going on simultaneously. Like there's times that I'm on a call and like I'm obviously like focused on supporting the person on the call or that I'm working with in person. And they say something, and this happens with my clients, like in therapy, this happened with a client who's 5, right? And like they just said something, and I was like, kiddo, I didn't say this to them, but I was like, you just solved something for me. Like something just clicked for me in this moment with you. And that happens to me all the time. So I think that it can be really motivating to be learning and I don't really want to say parallel paths, but like, you're traveling along with this person and inevitably it's like your work and their work is going to overlap. And I think opening up to that as a coach and knowing like obviously I'm staying focused on the person that I'm working with, on the athlete or the client, but also allowing myself to be open to like being changed and learning as I'm going has been, it's almost like being on a journey together is the thing that motivates me the most.
Yeah, that's really nice. I like that. I've definitely been guilty of making the odd little notes. You know, when someone said something and I'm like, wow, you just explained that in such a way, like, like an analogy or a metaphor or something where I'm like, I have to use this again. Um,
Yeah. And it's like
but
sometimes you use it in your coaching again, and sometimes you're like, oh, that one was just for me. That was
yeah,
like
yeah,
something that was in my life. Yes.
totally. Yeah. That's cool. What was the last thing you said? Because I wanted to, oh, it's like a journey together. So obviously, like, you're an expert in what you do, right? And with expertise comes knowledge. And, out of a group of climbers, you know more about mental training and trauma therapy and different tools to use in well-being and performance and all the rest of it. And so with that, you probably have opinions around like courses of action people might take or things people might do, right? So how do you kind of balance like sort of telling people what to do and passing on information and being somewhat advisory with also letting people find their own answers and also accepting their own truths and perspectives as well?
Yeah, that can be so challenging to have that, when you're thinking about walking alongside of someone, to say like, okay, one of the things I think I tend to err more towards the side of almost not being directive enough. And something, that's come up for me, something I've really worked on is not to only coach through questions, right? And that was in therapy, they teach you a lot about how affronting and confronting questions can be, because your client can start to feel like they're supposed to be getting some kind of answer right. And there is even a challenge sometimes to limit, like in my training, we did a helping skills class, and you had to do these mock therapy sessions where you weren't allowed to ask a single question. And you could only like guide by reflection, but you also weren't supposed to be directive or give advice. And that was the most challenging mock session I ever did, because I love questions. I love guiding, letting my curiosity and the other person's curiosity guide our work together. And sometimes, you know, an example of this is in a falling clinic. I learned to be a lot more directive with talking about yes and no fall zones. And instead of just starting out the conversation being like, what do you all think a yes fall zone might be? I try to own the conversations first and saying, so I'm going to introduce one definition of a yes fall zone as an area of climbing where you have experience taking that fall with relaxed body position. And then opening it up and saying, like, I'm going to define a no fall zone as everything else. Let's now talk about that. So that I didn't tell them, like, this has to be your definition of it, but I at least started it with that so that they didn't feel like in answering the question that they were like trying to figure out what I wanted them to say.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Totally. Yeah.
yeah.
No, that's really interesting because all my training to be a coach was really like a non-directive, non-advisory style. But then I've obviously had to pair that with being somewhat directive because there's obviously things that I know that other people don't know, like how to do good fall practice and stuff like that. So I've basically sort of done a combination of those two styles, but it is like every coaching call feels like a mission to balance that. And sometimes I feel like I do it really well. And sometimes I feel like I don't do it that well. And I'm like, oh, did I just tell them what to do? Like, what if that's not their truth? You know, like, what if that's not like something that resonates with them? And obviously, the coaching space, you can explore that too. But it is, I think, one of the biggest challenges as a coach or therapist, I imagine. So it's interesting. I can't imagine doing a session where you don't ask a single question. I honestly don't know what that would look like.
I haven't done an actual session with a client
Right. Yeah.
before
Yeah.
doing that. It was definitely practice, but it has definitely made me aware of like, why am I asking this question? Or like, what am I using this question for when I do choose them, which is cool.
Yeah. Have you seen that Netflix show Stutz?
Mm-hmm.
It's about someone's relationship with their therapist, and it's just like a hour and a half long documentary or something, and it's quite fun. And at the start of it, basically he says that he likes his therapist because his therapist does tell him what to do, and that he'd seen other therapists and he'd realized he'd got into the situation where the therapist was like this non-partial sounding board, and his friends who weren't experts were telling him what to do. And
Totally.
he's like, shouldn't it be the other way around? Like, shouldn't the therapist who's the expert be guiding me and my friends be like this impartial, open, non-judgmental sounding board? but what that makes me think of is kind of risk in the space and industry of psychology. And it's strange because in some ways I think we have poor intuitions around psychological risk. For example, even just falling is a really good metaphor for this, right? People think, well, if I don't physically hurt myself, then it's a fall I can take, which obviously doesn't it what it's not what it's ignoring there is the idea that there's such a thing as psychological harm and you can ingrain fear and all the rest of it. But at the same time, there's also sometimes we're too risk averse, sometimes I think, in the space of psychology, and we're too scared to give advice around wellness and mental health. So yeah, it would be interesting to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, it's actually the topic of my research. So
Oh,
that's
cool.
yeah, cool lead in. But we looked at this model that's called the community resiliency model. It's an organization called the Trauma Resource Institute. Designed this training to be a training that could be given to populations that weren't necessarily mental health professionals. So they taught it in hospitals and schools and refugee camps and all kinds of different spaces. And it teaches people about the nervous system. It teaches people about really basic techniques for tracking their own nervous system responses and then orienting back towards their own resilience through things that we're all already doing, like grounding and resourcing. But the main skill that it's teaching is like tracking the nervous system and just noticing. And it teaches folks about co-regulation. And so this idea that if we're standing next to someone, we can sense where they are in their nervous system based on what's going on in our nervous system. So for my research project for school, we trained 30 climbing guides in the community resiliency model and then asked them to go through their season. And then basically our focus groups, and this is, it's a total pilot study of this because there was no real literature and to go off of to make it more of like a quantitative study or anything. But we essentially just asked them before the study, what's your understanding of psychological risk? How does it come up in your work and in your personal climbing? Then at the end of the study, ask them the same questions and then ask them like, what would you want to see change in our culture around psychological risk? And we selected participants who were specifically using climbing as in some kind of very loosely therapeutic way. So whether they were running affinity spaces or working maybe with at-risk youth or, ran clinics that worked on fear. There were a lot of different folks in the clinic, but they had some slight orientation towards climbing being a wellness activity. And we selected for that considering that they might have some kind of heightened need for an understanding of psychological risk or might have some fear. So yeah, so you asking about that, it was looking at like how can we attune best to our participants to understand like where's that sweet spot where they're getting enough psychological risk to empower them and not so much that they're sustaining psychological harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely the balance. And we do that in physical training, like whether people know that they're doing that or not. But that's what physical training is, right? You stress the body enough that it gets strengthens, but not so much that you cause an injury. But it's just that conscious experience is a lot more complex than muscle tissue. So it's a lot harder to get it right. And there's also sort of, there's the risk of people working in that space, right? It's like it feels like for some people it's not somewhere where they want to go, right? Because it's almost like the potential harm could be greater than like a broken leg or something. What do you think in terms of expertise? Like, what kind of levels of training should people be having to work in the space of psychology? Or is it something that you feel like if more people were interested and more people felt free to work in this space, like we'd have more conversations around it?
Hmm. I think, well, that was part of when we were looking at the research and looking at approachable models. It was part of why we chose the community resiliency model, was this idea that if anyone is working in an adventurous space, even beyond climbing, but we looked at climbing because we're climbers, and that it's not something that they can avoid. It's like we can't just say, oh, I'm going to work with this population of people who's never going to have a stress response. Or like I'm going to self select this population that has never experienced trauma, because we don't screen our clients that way, right? And
Yeah.
so I think there's a big difference between trauma processing and supporting someone who's having a stress response.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of guides and coaches kind of struggle with that, where they think that when they hear supporting someone who's having a stress response, they hear, I'm supposed to be this person's therapist.
Mm.
And I like to really process trauma and to go into that space, we should have the skills to be in that space, right? Like we should
Mm.
be doing that as mental health professionals. But to support someone who's having a stress response, like it would be amazing, the way that CPR and first aid training is considered, like everyone who's a human with a heart and lungs should have that training, that we could do the same thing for supporting basic mental health first aid, of like, how do we support someone when in the community resiliency model, they call it out of your zone, right? Like your resiliency zone is when you're able to be online and like be the best version of yourself. And then you go out of that window of tolerance and you're out of your zone. And it's like, as humans who all go out of our zones, we should know how to support someone when they're out of their zone, and how to support ourselves when we're near someone who's out of their zone.
Yeah. No,
Did
that
that
makes
did that
sense.
answer your question?
No, it does definitely. Yeah.
Cool.
I think someone from our community may have had a question related to this. Yeah. Emily asks, how can you prepare yourself for situations where you might have to set boundaries, knowing that your brain might be flipping its lid a little in the moment? And so maybe you could, because I know that you use this phrase, flipping its lid to talk about stepping out of that zone. So maybe do you want to explain that and then maybe answer her question?
Yeah. The term flipping your lid comes from the hand model of the brain, which obviously, because this is a podcast, maybe we can link to a video of it.
Well, we might
But
put this on YouTube too, the
okay,
video. I probably
perfect.
should have told you that, but
Oh, it's fine. I would have adjusted my lighting better, but it's
it's all
also
good.
totally fine. Well, I'll talk through it and I'll try to be as help out the listeners as much as possible. But essentially, if we visualize our fist as a brain, and this is a metaphor, right? Because obviously our brain works on systems. It's not like separated into three parts that all do their own thing. But metaphorically speaking, like we have kind of a reptilian brain that's controlling our fight, flight, and freeze response. We have our emotional center in the limbic system, that's kind of this core part of our brain in the middle. And then we have our frontal cortex, which includes our prefrontal cortex, which is where we do most of our cognitive processing. And essentially, when we experience stress, we're going to process that in all of the parts of the brain are online until we get to a certain amount of stress where we sense that we need a survival response. That's controlled by the amygdala. And the amygdala is going to like sound its horn, go off, and then the frontal lobe is going to get less attention, right? Or we're not able to process that stress cognitively anymore, and we go into a survival response. It's nuanced when it actually happens. Like we're not just totally like going offline, unable to think, but our thoughts become less rational. We have less control over how they influence what we do with our actions. And so if we're going into a situation where we know that we're going to need to set a boundary. And we also know that we're at a risk of our lid flipping in the process. What I'm hearing is this difference between limits and boundaries is like, a limit, I think of limits as this thing that we need to set for safety. Like we absolutely don't cross our limits. And boundaries are this zone that are a little bit more flexible. Like if we set boundaries to preserve our enjoyment and find that sweet spot of challenge. And so what I'm hearing someone say is like, I'm trying to figure out my boundary without going beyond my limit. And that to me, it's like having some communication. I'm thinking of a situation like if I want to go up on a climb and I know that I want to set a level of challenge for myself, like maybe I'm taking all the time, like I never fall. And I want to push myself to, take a pause before I take and not like not just do it reactively, but I also want to preserve my option to take. And I want to maybe probe into falling practice, but I'm not sure if it's going to feel right for me. And I know that I have this super zealous belayer on the ground who like wants me to be over my fear of falling. And I'm going to get up there and they're going to be like, no, just go for it. Just go for it. And I know that I could flip my lid if I'm going into that situation. Then having a conversation about boundaries on the ground, we don't have to know exactly what it is, but we do have to have, like, we need to set the stage that we're going to be in the driver's seat. Like, this is how you can coach me. I really don't want you to like try and override my decisions when I'm up there, even if you think that I'm limiting myself. And then we can also do some work to understand, like, what is an appropriate amount of arousal to understand what might be an appropriate challenge. And that can take some self-awareness work, but we should know that like if we're rating body tension on a scale from like 1 to 10 and we're at a 10 out of 10 and like we're seeing red and we're not okay, like definitely too much, we're not learning. And probably like we should be at more of that 5 zone. So if someone's feeling like, oh, I'm going to 6, I'm going to 7, that's personal, right? It's subjective, but that would be a really helpful indicator to say like, oh, I gotta step back. I gotta really be honest about what learning would feel like for me right now.
What comes to mind there is sort of this like taking ownership of
Mm,
your climbing experience and your learning. And you kind of have to do that to set boundaries, especially with other people, right? And kind of go, actually, this is what I'm focusing on right now. This is how I want to manage my day and my experience on the rock. And it would be helpful if you could not make that more difficult, I guess. And it's really easy to not take that ownership, right? Because climbing is such a sport where we're in it together, which it makes it so wonderful, but also other people's ideas around what's best for you are so easily absorbed. Can you think of a time in your climbing where you felt that tension between like, you know, being part of a team, but also taking ownership of your own climbing experience?
oh yeah. Actually, it's a great example because I was just going to say as you were naming those things, like, oh, and it doesn't stop, right? Like we don't get to a point in our climbing where we've like graduated and there's not that pressure anymore. And I was just thinking about this fall having a conversation with a friend. We were both working on the same route, and I was placing this piece in a spot where, like, obviously it was not going to work when I was actually trying to red point. Like it just wasn't going to work, and I was like, that was definitely like limiting myself. But I just wasn't ready to not place it, and there was, I could feel that like kind of start and that gentle nudge from my friend to be like, you're really going to place that piece again? Like maybe you should just take it off your harness, like if you don't have it on your harness, you can't place it. And I just knew that it would like ruin my experience of the day. as I was working on this route and trying to make links if I took away that option because I would be like focusing on it. And I have enough trust in myself to know, like, hey, I'm like preserving my joy on the route today. I'm going up to do this other thing. I'm working on a different link. Like, I just want it on my harness. And actually, like, after a few times, I had that conversation with her, and she's, a rock star, like, amazing climbing partner. And she was just like, oh, yeah, that makes total sense. Like, you do you, you take that piece up. Like, I trust you. And 2 sessions later, I stopped placing it. It
Mm-hmm.
was like I didn't need it, and I knew that, but it meant so much to me to feel that support from her when I was feeling a lot of shame and a lot of, like, every time I would put it on my harness, I would like make this face of like, I know I'm bringing it up but I shouldn't, like, I don't need it. But and when I finally just said it to her of like, yeah, I am scared at that spot, and I don't feel comfortable yet climbing through it, and I really like placing this piece is letting me have fun. And when she just totally opted into that, she's like, "Oh yeah, like then you place it,
Mm-hmm.
and it became this thing where I wasn't carrying that anymore, and it just and it actually deepened our climbing relationship a lot because she's a very bold climber, so I often felt a little bit unsure of myself around her, and I felt like I was performing, and it actually like lessened that feeling around her for the
Mm.
rest of the season.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
really cool experience.
that's a really good example. And it just shows the power of just speaking your mind. I
Mm,
think we can forget like we're not mind readers. Like she
mm-hmm.
probably didn't know what you were thinking. She was
Yeah,
probably just like, why do they keep doing that?
exactly. Yeah, and like she was like totally thinking of it from a tactical perspective.
Yeah.
And just like, we talked through everything. She was like, well, why are you doing this? Like, obviously, this isn't tactical.
Yeah, that's interesting. Cool. So I want to kind of circle back a little bit to resilience. How do you define resilience and what's the sort of what's the opposite of resilience to you?
I think of resilience as the ability to be aware of our body, mind, and spirit's capacity to heal and to really thrive in all kinds of situations. I think that the opposite is probably like this perception that people or ourselves are like broken or unable to heal or thrive, or are like, when we think of this phrase of people doing the best they can in any situation and like looking at the resources that they use and just the body's like and mind's amazing ability to go through situations and use any resources available to stay safe and to be well. When we pathologize those things or think that they show that someone's a bad person, that can be the opposite of resilience. So yeah, that ability to sense into like our natural orientation towards well-being is, I think, how I would define resilience.
Nice, that's cool. So we have another question from one of our community members relating to resilience. And the question is, I would be happy to hear how Lor is using climbing as a resource for building resilience and empower individuals such as veterans. Do you work with veterans or?
I don't specifically.
So,
Um,
okay, maybe let's ignore that part of the question. I don't know.
yeah,
Arno has done some work with veterans, right?
yeah.
Yeah,
Arno
so
is a
so maybe
veteran,
there's
so
some
he's run
confusion.
some. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
run some programs for them.
But the question I think still works. So Steph's curious to know if you have worked with what she defines highly sensitive people and how this compares to the work you've done with climbers.
So the question was, how climbing can be used as a tool for building resilience.
in
And
in what she's calling highly sensitive people. So I don't know if
mm,
maybe that's sort of maybe people who've had difficult times, vulnerable people, maybe people who've suffered from trauma. And yeah, maybe you can clarify some of the work you might have done in that space. And then I guess, we could talk just generally about how climbing can be a resource for building resilience.
yeah, I think of climbing as this really, in a way, obviously it's a very complex sport, but it's also such a simple narrative when we get into it. It's this like we pick something that's too hard, we like figure out ways to approach it that feel fulfilling. And then at some point, we like achieve a little goal that gives us this sense of accomplishment. And then we choose something else that's a new challenge. And the stakes, obviously, when we think beyond like the safety systems, the stakes are so low. Like, there's times when we obviously need to be very conscientious. Obviously, like something going on in the climbing setup could result in serious injury or death. But beyond that, it's like we fall on our project and then we like reassess and we just try again. And I think that the lessons that climbing has about managing psychological risk, about becoming aware of our nervous system and of what's our intuition, like we really can intuition can be such a hard thing to like sit and talk about, but you watch people on the wall develop trust in their body to do things that they wouldn't be able to articulate why, but they start to be able to approach things just a little bit differently as they build that trust. And I think a lot of my work is like figuring out the ways that we block that in the climbing community and as climbing coaches, like because you see people's first experience of climbing, you rarely have to really do a ton of processing with them about that experience for them to like their mind is blown. They're like, my first day of climbing, I've never been more in my body. I've never been more in the moment. Like, what is this? And then you get them 5 years down the road when they're like trying to project a certain grade that means something and they've been, they're in or out of a climbing clique or all these different pieces. Then you're like, okay, let's like, how do we still make this an empowering space? And so I think when I look at that, I am looking at like, how do we build resiliency? Simply through giving someone the opportunity to continuously invest in something that brings them joy and like maximizing their joy in that space. And not necessarily like their sense of like, not like, oh, you always have to be happy when you're climbing, but giving you the space to like fully process just being a human on a rock climb and all the things that you go through up there. And I think when I was talking earlier about my work with my personal kind of journey towards looking into what it means to be an embodied person, that I've really viewed my own climbing as this act of embodiment that allows me to show up as the best version of myself in my community. I think that the term highly sensitive people, I know that it's a specific term that there was a book written about it. And I want to say that I don't have like a ton of specific experience with, like, I haven't read that book. I haven't like really looked into kind of how that term is defined specifically. But I know that many of the people that I work with who have experienced trauma have kind of self-identify with that term. And often what we end up seeing is what they're actually saying is like, when we were talking about flipping the lid earlier, they're like, my amygdala is primed where I flip my lid more easily. Um, and that, like, people, that can just happen biologically, but it does happen after an experience of trauma. And I think of that as like, oh my God, your brain did such a great job of adapting to be able to alert you more quickly so that you didn't get hurt. Or even if it was biological, it's like, oh, you just showed up with a brain that was like really ready to respond to a stressful situation. And in climbing, I think that can be really like, I'm thinking of a person I had in a clinic who gets on the wall and just start like we were doing falling practice, but she wasn't even starting the drill yet. She was just getting on the wall and just started sobbing, and I'm like, hey, like, what's going on? She's like, oh, don't mind me. I'm just the girl who cries on the wall. And kind of went on to explain how, like, this clinic probably wasn't going to work because she's hopeless. She feels so much more fear than everyone else in the room. And I work with a lot of people who I think of themselves that way of like, I'm a hopeless case or I'm just way more scared than everyone else. And when I look at that space, I think I personally thought of myself that way for a long time of like, I'm just a way more scared climber than everyone else. I try to like, look at that through the lens of like, oh, we're all a human with a nervous system and we all have a point to opt in. And it's kind of like saying, oh, I have no upper body strength. Maybe not as simple as that, but it's like, oh, but where's your variation where you can start training to do a pull up? Because if you
Totally, yeah.
find that and you start training today, you're going to get so much farther in your upper body strength than someone who can do 3 pull-ups today just naturally because they're like, quote unquote, like good at it, but they never train it. And I try and help people see that of like, oh, your nervous system is primed to react a little bit quicker. There's nothing wrong with that. We just need to work with that and find out where your entry point is and make sure that we're not letting you go into that place where you're flipping your lid just because maybe that's someone else's starting point. Um, there's nothing wrong with having to start somewhere else. It's actually just really listening to your body and letting yourself be on a learning journey as well.
Yeah, no, there's so many useful things you said there. Yeah, I mean, we're so used to having variation in other realms, like we all go to school and the class, every kid in the class is different, right? And so of course there's going to be that psychological variation, but we don't have a fixed mindset around what we can learn in other areas, but we so often have fixed mindsets around whether we are, whether we could be, brave or whatever, right? So yeah, it's something I see a lot with the people that I coached, that kind of fixed mindset around growing that psychological capacity. And I liked what you said, like we have different entry points. Um, that was cool. I guess it's tricky when we have labels for things, right? Like highly sensitive person or trauma victim or something like that, because the labels are kind of useful in many ways, right? Because they can inform, like, a bit like a diagnosis, but they can also be kind of limiting as well, right? Um, yeah, like how do you see these sorts of different labels, and where do you see them being useful and then also less useful?
Yeah, I mean, in the therapy world, right, we have like the diagnostic manual, like the DSM-5, that is such an amazing tool and is so limiting in so many ways, right? And especially in the world of trauma therapy, so many of my clients have been diagnosed with severe mental health disorders without the trauma being addressed. And in sometimes that has been done in hospital settings or in times when they didn't feel like they had a voice. They felt like they were just being told that they were something. And I think of diagnosis as like if it helps us understand and get the resources that we need, then we can use it as a tool. but we should be doing that in a narrative way. Like a person's diagnosis should include their whole story and it should be collaborative with that person. And I think that can be really similar with any label, like a highly sensitive person. That might help someone better understand what's going on for them. And if they can think, like, oh, I'm a highly sensitive person, so my lid gets flipped a little more easily. So that means that just because my friend just started here with their falling practice, I don't need to start there. I need to be more aware of what might be an appropriate level of challenge to start at. That if just having that label helps them frame that for themselves and look for the correct resources, and it's awesome. It's a tool. But when it becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, or when it feels like it was forced on them and it's not actually right for them, um, that's when it can be so limiting and start to get really icky.
Yeah. Okay, let's head a bit more towards some standard climbing stuff.
Yeah.
um, I'd be interested to know how you define success in climbing and how often you kind of challenge like the common notions of success in climbing, either with your own personal climbing or with the people you work with.
Mhm. Yeah, that's something I've thought about a lot because I definitely had a period in time in my life when I sent routes in ways that I'm not proud of. And that doesn't mean like ethically I wasn't proud of them, like I like pre-placed the piece or something. Not that that even matters in climbing, but just as an example. Um, but it was more like the means that I took to get there. I didn't arrive at the end feeling fulfilled or even healthy. Um, and I remember kind of a moment when I started to realize that like the process that I took to get there, like it had to be something that was sustainable for me. And it had to be something where along the way, every day that I was out, I was getting what I needed out of my climbing that day. And so I think that success for me now means showing up at the end of a process, whether it's the end of a trip or it's the end of working on a big project, or another goal or objective, using kind of the end of that, like the completion of the goal as an opportunity to reflect and say, okay, how did I do? You know, like how when I set out and I wanted to use climbing as this tool for wellness and for like living the most like joyful embodied life that I can, like along the way, when did I kind of stray away from that? And when was I able to be closest to that? And it's not like, you know, the days that I show up as the worst version of myself. I even have like a really sweet name for it, but I call it like my zoomy self, of like the person who just like gets to the crag and like doesn't care about anyone else's climbing and just wants to get in like the most pitches and like take my, you know, like do all the like get on all the hardest things that I want to get on. And it's like that's like this very like contracted selfish climber that can be there. And if it comes out, it doesn't mean that this whole process was a failure. It's just like, oh, what was going on that day? Like what led to me being like that? And I definitely use those kind of days as times to reflect and like do a little bit of self inquiry. So success for me is like showing up at the end of the process feeling like I really was able to show up as much as possible for myself and for the people that I care about.
Yeah, that's cool. It's almost like, you know, the process of a project becomes it's like a mindset goal in a way, right? It's like, cool, be great to send this project, but the main reason why I'm here is for the experience and for the learning and for the growth that comes with the process of trying that goal. I, you know, we talk a lot about that at Strong Mind, and a lot of people that we coach start to adopt like more mindset based goals, and be more process oriented. Do you have any tips for how to manage that moment where you know you've kind of failed at your goal for the day? Like, so say,
Mm,
say like, oh, like I'm just here to be like present with the process and like have a good time and be good to people around me and like, you know, all these great intentions. And then like you get to the end of the day and you're just like, wow, I really like failed at that. Like all I did was focus on trying to get to the top of this route and I couldn't think about anything else. And like I was completely distracted and I just botched it. You know, how to manage, because we've kind of gone one step on there, right? It's like often you're working with people who've got a lot of self-judgment around not sending. And now this is self-judgment around some of the deeper stuff, right? So yeah, do you have any tips for managing that moment?
yeah, I find like this, I do the same thing whether I was on, like, whether it was failing on a climb, which, like, I don't think any of us, I definitely am not in a place where I'm like so beyond the desire to send my rock climbs that I don't care if I like make the, send the day goal, whatever it was for the, like, if I like fall off lower than ever before on my project and I'm just having like a total shit climbing day, like there have been days that that's made me cry, and I'm just like heartbroken. And even though I know, I tend to approach projects with the mindset that if this climb truly is an appropriate challenge for me, that like there's a requisite number of goes that I'll have to give it before I send, and that the send is pretty certain if I put in that number of goes. And if it stops being enjoyable, like if I just literally feel like I've just banged my head against it too many times, I can always stop and I can always come back. So, and then at some point, my climbing career will be over and there will be rock climbs that I never sent. So I like have this knowledge. And even then, I'm like up there on the climb, just, I fall off something that I like, quote unquote, like wasn't supposed to. And I just like, my head's in my hands. I'm like, no, like, you know, and that when I'm there, I just remind myself, like, usually I'll just check in on that sense of entitlement of like, oh, I thought that like I deserved to extend the rock climb today. And like, I guess I need to put in more work. And sometimes I'll do a little bit of reflection, like, what did I do well? What can I improve? Just keep it simple. But on the days when I don't show up as the best version of myself, I think that can be harder. And then but I still try and like go back to that sense of entitlement. I was like, oh, you thought that you were like some kind of self-actualized person. Like, that's not
Yeah.
what you're up to, like that's just like not realistic. And then like try to be a little bit, that's why I have the joking name for it, even of like, this is my zoomy self. Cause I'm just like, oh yeah, like that's just, that's just how you showed up today. And then again, like look at what did I do well? What can I improve? And sometimes that does require like maybe an apology or just a reset for like, sometimes we go into spaces where we're like, I really got to show up better as a friend or as a climbing partner or as a significant other. Um, but sometimes it really is just a reset of like, yeah, no one else noticed. Like they all enjoyed climbing with you. It was just in your head that you were doing that. So the best thing to do is just like forgive and reset.
Hmm. Yeah, I really like what you said there about that entitled self. It's the ego, isn't it? It's the sort of the ego we all have coming up there. And what I was hearing you saying was kind of two things there. It was like bringing acceptance and humor, like humor that like you ever thought you were like that great, like
Yeah.
um and and then also, just a bit of acceptance, like you can't have every day be you can't be your perfect version of yourself every day. And sometimes you'll have bad days and you won't even know why they're bad. Sometimes you can reflect on it and be like, actually, maybe there's something I need to change. But sometimes it's just your stress levels were higher that day for whatever reason. Um, and that's okay.
Yeah. And being able to say like that the environment, like the amount of stress in the environment was what caused me to react in this really predictable way, rather than being like, I could have controlled that. It's such an important when you're using like acceptance. I think so many of us we start to learn about like these trauma informed and resiliency informed mindsets. And we're like, oh, yeah, that applies to everyone else. Like they're doing the best they can. Like they were reacting that way because that's a stress reaction. And it can take a lot longer to give that same acceptance to ourselves.
Yeah. And I think it comes with, you know, like we often forget how stressful an environment climbing is. Like if you go up to someone on the street and you're like, hey, I'm going to go and hang off the edge of a rock face today. And like at some points, I may fall through the air and like slam into the wall. And like this tiny, thin piece of rope is going to catch me. And like this skinny piece of webbing around my waist. People think you're mad, and like we've learned to kind of like normalize it all. And we've put in all of us have put in a lot of training, whether you realize it or not, to make those experiences less stressful, but they're still sort of stressful, right? They still trigger that all those primal warning signals in our nervous system. And so it's sort of like having a kind of a respect for that, I think, sometimes too.
And being able to soften into like ultimately the goal is to be able to notice when we are like going outside of our zone or we are having that reaction, and to be able to be accepting and self-compassionate enough that we can ask like, what would I need to feel safer in this environment today? And obviously sometimes like we can't ask that question if we don't really mean it. Like we can't just kind of throw it out into the world of like, what do I need? Because then it becomes like, what do I need to get back on track and like change myself, like it can take on a different kind of less helpful connotation. But if we're really in that space, like you're saying, of just being able to normalize and being able to say like, this is really stressful, so if I want to take on this amount of stress, like what do I need to feel safe here? What could I change in my environment to feel safer so that I can respond in a better way? That
Mm-hmm.
can become that really powerful question.
Totally, yeah. Yeah. And it's a shame that we don't have like setting those intentions as kind of like part of our community and culture in a way. Like even just the idea of kind of getting that psychological challenge level right for you is not something that you kind of hear talked about, right? So yeah, it's anyway, well, we're talking about it here, so that's a good start. It'd be cool to hear what you think about self-worth, because climbing can be this really like healthy contributor to self-worth, but it can also be the case that people pin too much self-worth on climbing, right? How would you like to think about that?
I think that one of the more powerful things that it was early on in my kind of, I was already a trainer for the Warriors Way, but I was doing a little bit of continued training, and Arno and I were just on a call, and he would just sometimes throw little like reminders out to me, um and he said something along the lines of, how would you climb today if your sense of self-worth was completely static? Like if there was nothing that you could do to be any more worthy of love and belonging and all of the things that humans deserve, and there was nothing you could do to be any less. And I remember just that specific way that he phrased it, and it being phrased by someone that I trust. And I was going into a climbing day that way. And I think that our sense of self-worth, like our ability to sense into it, does fluctuate. But when we really like can hold, like I love to like kind of revisit this idea of like, what if that self-worth, or what if my worth as a human is actually can't change, then what would I be up to? And give it, and then also get that extends to everyone I interact with, right? Of saying, um, there's nothing you can do to change it, right? So, um, yeah, I do a lot of work with athletes around like sense of self and tying identity to outcome, and just softening that can be more complex than just saying my sense of self-worth is static. Um, because it's sneaky, right? That gets into like this idea of ego, um and really, like we don't want to say that we can't celebrate sens, or we can't enjoy ourselves, which I think sometimes people can be say, oh, if I'm not supposed to tie my identity to outcome, then I just have to observe everything as if I'm floating above my body. And I'm like, ooh, that sounds sneakily like dissociation. Like maybe we do want to be really engaged and we want to care, and we can hold that truth to be something that's important, is like caring about the outcomes that we produce without thinking that it makes our sense of self-worth fluctuate.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, it's like, I guess you want to be careful how your performance and your achievements in climbing affect the things that are important to your well-being, right? Because we can't always be sending, we can't always be performing well. So it's a kind of a vulnerable position to be in when you're like, well, I can only really be happy if I've done this, and that in climbing. And in my early 20s, I wouldn't say my happiness was like fully dependent on climbing or anything, but there would definitely be this sort of like nagging feeling I would get if I felt like I hadn't accomplished something in a while. And it, that's a sign for me that there's too much dependency there on accomplishments in climbing. But yeah, you also don't want to go so far the other way and just totally dissociate from like the successes. And honestly, like sometimes I feel like I've maybe taken it too far, because some of like the bigger sends in the past few years haven't really, you know, I mean, maybe it's not too far, because really all the joy was in the process, and it wasn't like I didn't find the process joyful, but there wasn't like this huge celebration feeling, at the end of some of these projects. So yeah, it's a balance for sure. But I guess, I really like that idea of like, what if your self-worth was static? But how do you manage that if you feel like yourself or someone you're working with has a real low sense of self-worth, where the kind of self-worth that kind of becomes almost like into self-compassion, right? It's like there's a real maybe lack of love for yourself, lack of respect maybe, and then that kind of spreading out into low self-worth, low self-confidence. What do you think are kind of like healthy sources of self-worth and self-confidence?
Yeah, I mean, my brain went immediately, just because of the work that I do in the queer community. It went immediately to kind of this idea of radical self-love, and that I was referencing earlier. And this question of like, if we don't believe that we're worthy of love and belonging, who put that thought there, and how is it serving them? Because I think I was in that space where I hated my identity to such an extent, because I thought it was going to hurt me, right? I thought other people were going to hurt me because of my identity, that I would go to any cost to like get rid of it, to prove that I wasn't like the stereotypes. That it was a huge part of my running career that I, even to this day, I still can't really piece out if I ever loved running. But I got so much praise for it that it felt safe for me there. And so when I think of someone who has low self-esteem or low self-worth, I often wonder, who put that there? Like, why, what's going on And in my coaching, I do less of that inquiry, but I will talk about systemic injustice with folks, especially folks that bring it up themselves or that are obviously experiencing that. And just kind of I'll plant that seed there and let them do some of their own exploration. And in therapy, we do a lot more dissecting of that. We're like, ooh, like, where did that thought come from? Like, why, and oftentimes I think sensing into connection and sensing into relationship is so much more healing than trying to give people like a sense of separate self-worth. If someone can feel like they're part of a growth fostering relationship, they're that sense of worth or that sense of being someone who deserves love and belonging really grows. So I think that's one of the powers of the climbing community is that while there are a lot of flaws, we do have this foundation and this general desire to be a community where people are accepted and belong. And we've often viewed ourselves as a landing space for people. We have to do a lot of work to actually make that a reality. But if we can create even little pockets within that community, I've had a lot of amazing opportunities to work in affinity spaces that have done a really great job of creating those little pockets where it's like someone comes in and it's like, just because you're here, like your love and belonging, your like kind of worthiness or like your ability to be here is like a non-issue. That's not even something we have to consider in this space. So then you get to go out and like have experiences as a human and know that you're always going to be able to like look around you and see people who value you as a human and see that sense of self-worth as something that is a non-negotiable, that then people can start to sense into that themselves. So I think that there can obviously be self-compassion work or other things that we bring in as tools and like one-on-one coaching, but more than anything, it's like building communities of collective caring.
Yeah, that's interesting. It makes so much sense, right? Because we're such social creatures and our sense of self-worth can't ever be separate from how we feel others respond to us, right? But it's also difficult because, where does the support from your community become like in people's minds, maybe desire for praise or external validation, right? Which become then maybe more kind of vulnerable places to get our sense of self-worth from. And we see that so much with social media, like the likes on this photo of me sending my recent project, like that's my community caring for me, or is that something else, I don't know if what you think about that.
Yeah, I guess that's where that like difference between something that's like this is a non-negotiable, like just because you're here, you belong, and that feeling of like, oh, I can like ride the waves of people's appreciation of me or celebration. And I've experienced that myself in the climbing community of having people that I love, that I really appreciate their friendship, but they only started talking to me when I like asked them certain benchmark of grade. And it is always in the back of my head of like, where does that love come from this person? And if I had never reached that grade, like, would I know them, or would they have spent the time talking to me? And I think that even if we're getting sometimes the times when we're getting the most likes and the most praise for something that we did that was external, that can be the time when we feel our sense of self-worth is the most vulnerable. And those are sometimes, and I think sensing into that can be helpful for folks of like, oh, would you feel more sense of self-worth if you sent your project and all of a sudden everyone liked you? Like even just asking that question hypothetically sometimes can set people up to be aware of that kind of cognitive faux pas. But I think beyond that, like having experiences of acceptance, of self-acceptance, or of being accepted into a community, or even of starting out with just accepting others as like fully worthy to be here and to receive like love and belonging, that all of those are way more restorative and can help show the difference between that vulnerability of like whether it's likes on social media or like high fives on the ground. It means a lot more when people are celebrating because they already love you than them celebrating your accomplishment
Mm.
only.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting that though, because I think that that love and respect is probably something that you can only get from people you know, right? Like I know that we want to love everyone in a community to some extent, but like and we always want to treat people with like a default amount of respect and compassion and empathy and humanity and all the rest of it, right? But at the same time we can't show up for everyone. Um we can't even like everyone, right? Like it's naive to think that like there's a lot of people who I respect and want to treat kindly who I don't necessarily want to go climbing with all the time, right? So it is kind of difficult to balance all of that on a community level, especially when you throw social media into the mix. But yeah, it's definitely something to strive for there. And I like the way you word this as this is this non-negotiable thing, um and asking questions around that can be really useful for people, I think, especially when there's that sense of I need to accomplish this thing and fear around not accomplishing that thing. Do you have any other helpful things that people can do to kind of manage some of those fear-based thoughts and emotions when approaching big goals and projects and that kind of thing?
Yeah, like that the fear of like not belonging or something, like those kinds of fears.
Yeah, sort of like like when something that was intrinsically motivating for you starts to become extrinsically motivating, that sense of like, I want to get this thing done, the sense of fear that people often find they when they think about not doing this thing that they have spent so much time working towards. Um, I think that comes up for a lot of climbers, especially climbers who are setting big goals.
I think one of the practices that has been most helpful for me is like if I'm, I think I was talking about like finding safe communities, and like the reality is we can't, like we're not always going to find those. Not that we always can't, but um as a climber who's traveled a lot, been on the road a lot, and been solo a lot, and also like as a trans climber who's like doesn't really pass, that I show up in spaces and sometimes I don't feel safe. And I think I've had to do a lot of self-compassion work to retain that understanding that I deserve to be safe, even if I don't feel safe right now. And those are two different things. And if I deserve to be safe, then I'm gonna look for that. I'm gonna move myself in the direction of safety rather than think that I just have to take it all in and like just deal with it. Um, but so I do a lot of self-compassion work, and I've done a lot of practicing to be in a space where I can offer self-compassion, like in a pretty embodied way, like putting my hand on my heart and just being like, oh, buddy, like you are just using an approach, like you just care so much about what people think right now, or you're just so in that space. Um, but when I'm working with athletes or clients who don't have as much experience, maybe like sometimes I'll have them write a letter to themselves or even like a specific part of themselves that either they might write a letter to the part that's being really self-critical, um, and maybe it can even be like snarky or silly, or they can write a letter to the part of them that feels really tender and really afraid. Um, And sometimes doing that cognitively can start to open up that space of like, oh yeah, like this is really going on for you and this is such a real feeling. And like what's coming up that's a need for you? Like what would it really look like for you to feel safer? That oftentimes that compassion and that desire to get our needs met comes up naturally as we start to do a little bit of that work and just pay attention a little bit.
Nice. I like that. Um, cool. Well, I don't know how you feel, but maybe we could leave it there. I feel like we've covered a lot of really interesting stuff there. And you've got such a wonderful perspective on a lot of these topics. And I think people will learn a lot from what we've spoken about.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. I feel like we could do a part two as well and maybe like pick one thing to like really get into.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I would
But it
love
was
that.
a nice sort of like covering a lot of the common topics. Was there anything you felt like maybe we missed?
I think on that last, I had one more sentence I was going to say on that
Oh,
last piece that
sorry.
I just was like, oh no, it's okay. I just like, I wasn't, I was like, maybe I'll say it, maybe I won't. And then but knowing it's the end, just, that when I was talking about like sensing into what we need, it's like our bodies already know,
Mm,
and like we usually like if we start to slow down and be a little bit quieter, like we often already know what we need to like increase our sense of self-worth or increase our embodiment or like work more in line with what we need towards a goal. And so it's often not like doing a ton of like figuring out work. It's more like decreasing the things that are making it hard to hear.
mm, yeah, I guess, and then the sense of sort of like letting things be and letting yourself be rather
Mm-hmm.
than trying to change so much all the time and just being
Yeah.
kind of open to stuff rather than closed. Um, it's quite an interesting approach. Go on, I have just one more question then. It is fairly basic. What are you looking forward to? What have you got on the horizon? What are some of your climbing and work goals?
Oh yeah. I have a project up in Moab that I've been working. This is going to be my third season on it, so that's kind of this and awesome, and I'm just so in love with it. So I'm
I
excited
saw
to
a
spend more
video of
time.
you with one shoe on. Is this the project?
Yeah,
I
that's
saw
it.
that video and my foot started crying for you.
Less painful than it looks. It's Mason Earl's route, and he came up with
Hmm.
that beta, and just
Yeah,
it's actually like really, really awesome beta. Um,
nice.
but yeah, and then climbing around. I live in Flagstaff, so I love roof bouldering around there. It's kind of like a new obsession that there's just like endless opportunities to practice in Flagstaff. There's so many roofs everywhere.
Nice.
Um, and then, I'm starting a new position as a therapist this month and um, loving the coaching work that I'm doing. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of exciting things on the
Yeah,
horizon.
sounds very exciting. Well, thanks for doing what you're doing, and I wish you all the best with all these ventures, and I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much, Hazel.